The final suture slid through flesh with a practiced, almost bored precision. Dr. Marcus Thorne tied it off with a flourish, a surgeon's knot that was as much performance as it was function. He snipped the thread and dropped the needle holder onto the stainless steel tray with a clatter that echoed his own self-satisfaction. "Close him up, Richardson." It was not a request. It was a dismissal. Evelyn Richardson nodded, her face obscured by a standard-issue surgical mask. Her eyes, a startlingly clear shade of gray, betrayed nothing. She moved in as Thorne stepped back, her motions fluid and economical. No wasted energy. No performance. Just the quiet, methodical work of putting a man back together. "A simple appendectomy," Thorne announced to the resident hovering at his elbow. "But elegance is found in simplicity. Is it not?" Notice the clean incision, minimal bleeding. The textbook example. The resident, a young man named Peterson, whose face was a permanent mask of nervous admiration, nodded vigorously. "Yes, Dr. Thorne." "Perfect." Thorne stripped off his gloves and tossed them into the biohazard bin. He glanced back at the table, at Evelyn's hands moving with a speed and dexterity that seemed out of place. She was just a nurse, after all. A surgical nurse, yes, but still. Her movements were too sure, too confident. It was unsettling. "A little faster, Richardson," he said, his tone clipped. "We don't get paid by the hour for this." He shared a smirk with Peterson. It was a common refrain, one of the many small, casual cruelties he aimed at her throughout the day. She never reacted. That was the most infuriating part. She just absorbed the barbs, her silence a strange sort of defiance. She was an enigma. She'd shown up 6 months ago, overqualified for a surgical nurse position, but, according to hospital administration, eager for the role. Her resume was sparse. A nursing degree from a state college, a few years at a community hospital in the Midwest. Nothing to suggest the ghost of competence that flickered in her eyes. Nothing to explain the way she anticipated the needs of a surgery 3 steps ahead of the surgeon himself. Thorne found it grating. He was the star of this operating room. The chief of trauma surgery, his word was law, his skill unquestioned. And this quiet, unassuming nurse moved around his sanctum like she owned it, her silence a constant, low-grade challenge to his authority. He'd seen her catch things. A misplaced clamp. A subtle dip in a patient's O2 saturation that the anesthesiologist had missed. She never made a show of it. A quiet word. A pointed glance. She made her corrections in the shadows, allowing others to take the credit, or more often, to remain oblivious that a mistake had been averted at all. It made him look for faults. He watched her like a hawk, waiting for a slip, a moment of weakness he could pounce on. It never came. Her work was flawless, annoyingly so. Today was her last day. She'd turned in her notice 2 weeks prior, no explanation. Just a crisp, formal letter left on the charge nurse's desk. Thorne had felt a surge of triumph when he heard the news. He was finally getting rid of the silent judgment in those gray eyes. He left the operating room without a backward glance, letting the door swing shut on the quiet, efficient work of the nurse he'd never bothered to understand. Evelyn finished the last of the subcutaneous stitches, her hands a blur. She applied the dressing, her touch gentle but firm. The patient was stable. The surgery, despite Thorne's bluster, had been routine. She stripped off her own gloves and gown, her movements weary. 6 months. 6 months of biting her tongue, of forcing her hands to move slower than they were able, of pretending to be less than she was. It had been a necessary exile, a penance of sorts, but the weight of it was crushing. She had come to this place, this unremarkable hospital in this forgotten corner of the country, seeking anonymity. She had craved the mundane, the predictable rhythm of civilian medicine. Appendectomies and gallbladders, broken bones and benign tumors, the quiet, orderly world of healing, so different from the screaming chaos of tearing things apart. But the quiet had been its own kind of prison. The condescension, a constant, abrasive reminder of the life she'd left behind. Thorne, with his petty tyrannies and his preening ego, was the embodiment of everything she had sought to escape, yet in a form so diluted it was almost laughable. He thought his operating room was a battlefield. He had no idea what a real one looked like. He had never held a life in his hands while the world exploded around him. He had never had to choose which shattered body to save and which to let die. Her final shift was almost over. Just a few more hours of paperwork, of handing off her responsibilities, and then she could walk out that door and never look back. She could disappear again. Find another quiet place. Try to outrun the ghosts. She walked through the hushed corridors of the surgical wing, the squeak of her sneakers a lonely sound. Nurses at the central station glanced up, offering tired smiles. They'd liked her, in their way. She was reliable, competent, never complained. But she was distant. An island. No one really knew her. No one had ever asked. That was how she wanted it. She reached her locker, the small metal box that held the last vestiges of her temporary identity. She spun the combination. The familiar clicks a countdown to her freedom. Inside was her worn leather purse and a set of car keys. Nothing else. She traveled light. Always, she changed out of her scrubs and into a pair of faded jeans and a plain gray t-shirt. She looked at herself in the small, cracked mirror taped to the inside of the locker door. The woman staring back was a stranger. Tired eyes. Hair pulled back in a severe bun. A face scrubbed of personality. A ghost. It was a fitting name. The overhead speakers crackled to life, the sound sharp and urgent. Code 3, Trauma Bay. Code 3, Trauma Bay. A voice she recognized, frantic, one of the emergency room residents. EMVA on the interstate, multiple vehicles. State police report at least 6 critical. ETA, now. The calm of the hallway shattered. A flurry of motion. Nurses grabbing charts, doctors jogging towards the emergency department entrance. The low hum of the hospital escalated into a roar of controlled panic. A mass casualty incident. A mass gal. Evelyn stood frozen, her hand on the locker door. This was not her problem anymore. Her shift was over. She was a ghost. Ghosts don't get involved. She could just walk away, turn her back, get in her car and drive until the sound of the sirens faded into memory. It was what she had been doing for 2 years. Running. Another announcement, this one from the ER charge nurse. Her voice strained. We need all available hands in the ED. I repeat, all available surgical and ER staff to the emergency department now. All available hands. Her hands. Her hands, which had clamped bleeding aortas in the back of a shaking Black Hawk. Her hands, which had performed tracheotomies with a pocket knife and a ballpoint pen casing. Her hands, which knew the intricate, brutal anatomy of a body shredded by an eye. She closed the locker door. The decision was not a decision at all. It was an instinct, buried but not dead. A reflex forged in fire and blood. You do not run from the sound of the guns, you run toward them. She turned and began to walk, then jog, toward the chaos, toward the one thing she was better at than anyone else in this building, toward the very hell she had tried so desperately to escape. The emergency department was a scene from a nightmare. The air was thick, with the smell of blood and antiseptic, a metallic tang that coated the back of her throat. Gurneys were everywhere, a chaotic logjam of pain and fear. The floor was slick with things she didn't want to identify. Doctors and nurses moved with frantic energy, but it was disorganized. Uncoordinated, they were accustomed to handling one trauma at a time, maybe two. A Moscow was a different beast. It required a different mindset. It required triage. The brutal calculus of combat medicine. She saw Thorne in the center of it all, his face pale, his usual arrogance replaced by a deer in the headlights' terror. He was shouting orders, but they were contradictory, reactive. He was trying to plug 100 holes in a dam that was already collapsing. Get him to CT. Now. He yelled, pointing at a man with a clear head injury. Sir, Bay 2 is crashing. A nurse called out. I need a chest tube kit over here. Another voice screamed. They were treating the symptoms, not the system. They were going to lose people. Evelyn moved through the chaos like a phantom. She wasn't wearing scrubs, wasn't part of the team. She was just a civilian in a gray t-shirt. An observer. But her eyes were not observing. They were assessing, cataloging, prioritizing. Gurney 1, male, 30s, massive abdominal evisceration. Black tag. He was already gone, his life spilling out onto the white sheets. Nothing could be done for him here. To try would be to waste resources, to kill someone else by proxy. Gurney 2, female, 20s, obvious bilateral femur fractures, screaming in agony. The pain was horrific, but she was conscious and breathing. Yellow tag. She was injured, but she was stable for now. She could wait. Gurney 3, teenage boy, unconscious, shallow respirations, a deep, sucking chest wound. Red tag. He was dying. Right now. He needed a chest tube and a needle decompression, and he needed it 10 seconds ago. She saw a young resident fumbling with an intubation kit near the boy, his hands shaking. Evelyn stepped forward. Give me that, she said, her voice low and calm, yet carrying an authority that cut through the noise. The resident looked up, confused. Who are you? Give it to me. You're holding the laryngoscope upside down. She didn't wait for an answer. She took the equipment from his hands. Her movements were a blur of efficiency. She tilted the boy's head back, inserted the blade, visualized the cords, and slid the tube home in a single, seamless motion. It took less than 5 seconds. Bag him, she ordered the stunned resident. And get me a 14-gauge needle and a chest tube tray. Now, he just stared at her. Move. She barked, the single word a whip crack. He scrambled to obey. Thorne saw the exchange from across the room. He started to stride toward her, his face a thundercloud of indignation. Richardson, what in God's name do you think you're doing? You're a nurse. You don't intubate. Before he could reach her, the main doors burst open again. 2 more paramedics wheeled in a gurney, moving fast. The man on it was a soldier. She could tell by the haircut, the lean, hard-muscled frame visible through the shredded remnants of his uniform. His body was a roadmap of catastrophic injury. One leg was gone below the knee, a hasty tourniquet cinched high on his thigh. His chest and abdomen were peppered with shrapnel wounds, dark and ugly against his pale skin. But it was his face that made her blood run cold. She knew him, Sergeant Jake Vance. Ripper, a ranger. A man she had pulled from the wreckage of a downed helicopter in the Karengal Valley. A man who shouldn't be here. A man who should be safe. The paramedic rattled off his stats. SWO is what we thought at first, but it's fragmentation. Looks like some kind of training accident. BP is 60 over palp, heart rate 150. We've pushed 2 liters of saline, but we can't get a pressure. Vance was dying. The gray, waxy pallor of his skin, the thready pulse, the distant look in his eyes. He was circling the drain. Massive internal hemorrhage. Cardiac tamponade. Maybe he had minutes. Less. Thorne was at the gurney's side instantly, his earlier anger forgotten in the face of this new, critical arrival. Get him into Trauma 1. Type and cross for 6 units and start the massive transfusion protocol. Get me a fast scan machine in here. They wheeled Vance into the primary trauma bay, a room now crowded with equipment and people. Evelyn followed, a shadow drawn to a familiar darkness. Thorne was all business now, back in his element, or so he thought. He ran the ultrasound probe over Vance's abdomen. He's full of fluid. Blood. I need an oar. Now. Doctor, Evelyn said, her voice quiet but insistent. Thorne ignored her. Let's get him upstairs. We can stabilize Dr. Thorne, she said again, louder this time. He's not going to make it to the elevator. He finally turned to her, his eyes blazing with fury. I did not ask for your input, Richardson. Your shift is over. You are a civilian in my trauma bay. Get the hell out of here before I have security remove you. The words hung in the air, a final, definitive insult. Evelyn looked from Thorne's arrogant face to Jake Vance's dying one. The past and the present collided in that small, crowded room. The ghosts she had been running from were no longer behind her. They were right here, in front of her, demanding a reckoning. I can leave. I can walk out that door and let this arrogant fool kill a man I once saved. I can let him die because protocol is more important than life. I can be Nurse Richardson, the quiet, competent woman who knows her place. Or I can be who I really am. Jake Vance's eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy with pain and shock, but they found her. They scanned her face, a flicker of disbelief, of impossible recognition. His lips moved, forming a single, rasping word, a name no one in this room had ever heard. Ghost? The sound was barely a whisper, but it landed in the sudden silence of the room like a grenade. Every head turned, every pair of eyes fixed on her. The nurse in the gray t-shirt. The woman who shouldn't be there. Thorne stared, his mouth slightly agape. What did he call you? Evelyn met his gaze. The mask was gone. The years of hiding, of suppressing, of being less than, fell away in an instant. The woman standing there now was not Nurse Richardson. It was someone else entirely. Someone harder. Someone colder. Someone who did not have time for his foolish pride. He's in tamponade, she said, her voice level, sharp, and utterly commanding. His heart is being crushed by the blood filling his pericardial sac. The fast scan is useless if you don't know what you're looking for. We open his chest, right here, right now, not a suggestion, a statement of fact, an order. Thorne was speechless. The entire room was frozen, caught in the gravity of her sudden transformation. You can't be serious, he stammered. An emergency thoracotomy? In the bay? That's butchery. The protocol is, your protocol is killing him. She snapped, her voice echoing in the stunned silence. She pointed a finger at the cardiac monitor. The beautiful rhythmic peaks and valleys of Vance's heart rate were gone, replaced by a chaotic, jagged line. Ventricular fibrillation. Cardiac arrest. He's coding. A nurse shouted. Paddles. Thorne yelled, grabbing the defibrillator paddles. Charge to 200. Clear. Vance's body jerked on the gurney. The line on the monitor didn't change. Again. Charge to 300. Clear. Another convulsive jerk, still VFib. He's not coming back, Thorne said, a note of defeat in his voice. The heart's empty. We can't shock what isn't there. He looked at the clock on the wall, ready to call the time of death. Evelyn stepped between him and the gurney. Get out of my way, she said. It was not a request. Thorne hesitated, his pride warring with the undeniable authority that now radiated from her. He saw something in her eyes, a chilling certainty, an absolute command of the moment that he, the chief of trauma, had never possessed. Who are you? He whispered. Evelyn didn't answer. She turned to the terrified resident she had corrected earlier. You, get me a number 10 scalpel, a Finocchietto retractor, and the biggest clamps you have. And you, she said, pointing to a seasoned trauma nurse, start hanging O-negative blood on a pressure bag. I want it flowing before I make the first cut. Everyone else, get ready. This is going to be messy. The team, shocked into action by the sheer force of her will, scrambled to obey. They moved without question, their training kicking in, overriding their confusion. They recognized a leader when they saw one, and it wasn't the man with the title. It was the woman in the gray t-shirt. Thorne watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the nurse handed Evelyn a scalpel. You can't do this, he said, his voice weak. You'll be arrested. I'll lose my license. Evelyn paused, the blade held steady in her hand, poised over Jake Vance's chest. She looked Thorne directly in the eye. The quiet nurse was gone forever. In her place was the ghost of Kandahar. Watch me. The scalpel sliced down, a long, curving incision from sternum to spine, following the line of the 5th intercostal space. Blood welled instantly, a shocking crimson against pale skin. Her hands moved with a brutal, practiced grace. There was no hesitation. This was muscle memory. This was a language her body had never forgotten. More suction, she commanded. The wound was deepened. Muscle layers parted. Ribs became visible. Mayo scissors. Heavy, the instrument was slapped into her palm. She drove the tips through the intercostal muscles, spreading them wide. Then, with a series of sharp, powerful snips, she cut through the cartilage connecting the ribs to the sternum. Retractor, the Finocchietto, a heavy, geared device like a medieval jack, was placed into the opening. She cranked the handle. There was a sickening series of cracks and pops as Vance's ribs were forced apart, opening his chest cavity to the world. The room gasped. Even the veteran nurses, who had seen everything, flinched. Thorne felt bile rise in his throat. This was not surgery. This was vivisection. But Evelyn was serene, a calm island in a sea of her own making. Her eyes scanned the exposed organs, her mind processing the horrific tableau with cold, analytical detachment. The left lung was collapsed, but that wasn't the immediate problem. The pericardial sac, the fibrous bag surrounding the heart, was stretched taut and was a deep, bruised purple. It was filled with blood. The tamponade. She had been right. Metzenbaum scissors. She carefully nicked the pericardium. A geyser of dark, non-clotting blood erupted, splashing onto her face and shirt. It was the sign she was looking for. The pressure was released. She widened the incision, exposing the heart itself. It lay there, quivering and still. It was not beating. It was just a flaccid, useless muscle. "All right, Jake," she whispered, so softly only she could hear. "Let's wake you up." She slid her hand into his chest, her fingers wrapping around his heart. It felt like a warm, wet bird in her palm. And she began to squeeze. A steady, rhythmic compression. Internal cardiac massage. She was pumping his heart for him, forcing blood through his body with the strength of her own hand. "His pressure is coming up," a nurse called from the monitor. 60/40. It was a miracle. A dead man now had a blood pressure. "Good," Evelyn said, her voice tight with concentration. "Keep the blood coming. Now let's find the hole." Her other hand, slick with blood, probed the surface of the heart. Her fingers were her eyes. She felt for the telltale tear, the wound that was pouring his life into his chest. There, a small jagged hole in the right ventricle. A piece of shrapnel had pierced it clean through. "I've got it," she announced. "I need a Satinsky clamp." And a 3/0 proline suture on a small needle. She couldn't use her finger to plug the hole. She needed that hand to keep his heart beating. This was the impossible part. The part where everything could go wrong. "I can't clamp that," Thorne said, finding his voice at last. It was a statement of awe, not protest. "The ventricular wall is too thin. The clamp will tear it to pieces. A Satinsky won't," Evelyn replied without looking at him. "It's an atraumatic vascular clamp. It'll hold without crushing. Now get it for me." Someone slapped the long, angled instrument into her free hand. She guided it deep into the chest cavity, the steel disappearing into the bloody morass. She couldn't see. She could only feel. "Okay, easy," she murmured to herself. She positioned the jaws of the clamp on either side of the tear in the ventricle. She closed the handle. The ratchet clicked once. Twice, she held her breath. The bleeding from the hole slowed, then stopped. The clamp was holding. Suture. The needle was placed in her hand. Still pumping the heart with her left hand, she began to sew with her right. A series of tiny, precise stitches closing the wound in the wall of a major chamber of his heart. It was a feat of ambidextrous skill that was beyond comprehension. It was like a mechanic rebuilding an engine while it was still running. Thorne watched, his entire understanding of medicine being rewritten before his eyes. The arrogance he had worn like armor had been stripped away, leaving him raw and exposed. He was a first-year medical student again, watching a master at work. He wasn't just a surgeon, he was a god. No, not a god. Something else. A ghost. She placed the last stitch and tied it off. "Clamp off," she said. She released the Satinsky. The suture line held, no new bleeding. She continued the cardiac massage for another 30 seconds, perfusing the heart muscle with fresh, oxygenated blood. "Okay," she said, her voice strained with effort. "Everybody stand back. I'm going to try and restart him." She looked at the anesthesiologist. "Give me 10 cc's of epinephrine directly into the ventricle." A syringe with a long needle was passed to her. She guided it carefully and injected the drug straight into the heart muscle she was holding. "All right, Jake," she whispered again. "Come on back." She gave his heart one final, powerful squeeze, and then she let go. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The heart lay still. The monitor remained flatlined. The room held its collective breath. Then, a single tentative flicker. A twitch. The monitor beeped. A single, beautiful Chiars complex bloomed on the screen. Another and another. A slow, steady sinus rhythm. "We have a heartbeat," the nurse at the monitor said, her voice choked with emotion. BP is 90/60 and rising. A wave of relief washed through the room, so palpable it was like a physical force. People sagged against walls. Someone started to cry softly. Evelyn stood over the open chest of the man she had just pulled back from the brink of death. She was covered in his blood, her arms trembling from exertion. She looked down at the steady, beating heart, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something other than emptiness. She had not just saved a life, she had reclaimed a piece of her own. Thorne stepped forward slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. He looked at her, then at the patient, then back at her. The condescension, the mockery, the professional jealousy, it was all gone, burned away by the impossible thing he had just witnessed. "My God," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Who are you?" Evelyn finally looked up at him. The fire in her eyes had banked, replaced by a profound weariness. "I'm the nurse who's off the clock," she said. She stripped off her bloody gloves and dropped them to the floor. "He's stable for now. Get him to an oar, do a proper washout, and close him up. He'll need a full course of antibiotics and watch him for renal failure from the blood loss. But he'll live." She turned and walked out of the trauma bay without another word, leaving a room full of stunned medical professionals and one miraculously alive soldier behind her. She pushed through the doors of the emergency department and into the main corridor, the adrenaline beginning to fade, leaving a hollow ache in its place. She had done it. She had revealed herself. The ghost was out of the machine. There would be questions now. An investigation. She had violated every rule in the book. It didn't matter. She had upheld the only rule that ever truly counted: you save the life in front of you. She made it back to the locker room, her legs unsteady. Her hands were shaking now, a delayed reaction to the immense concentration and stress. She stared at her reflection in the mirror. Blood was spattered across her cheek and matted in her hair. The woman staring back was no longer a stranger. She was a warrior, marked by a battle she had just won. She washed her face and hands at the basin, the water turning pink as it swirled down the drain. She had to leave. Now, before the questions started, before the consequences of her actions came crashing down on her, she grabbed her purse and keys and walked toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet hospital. The Maskell was under control. The chaos had been tamed, largely because of the triage and direction she had provided in those first critical minutes. She pushed open the glass doors and stepped out into the cool evening air. Freedom. It was so close. Her car was just across the parking lot, a small, anonymous sedan that could take her anywhere. Another town, another life, another chance to disappear. She was halfway to her car when the trucks pulled in. 3 of them. Matte black, military-grade SUVs with tinted windows. They didn't drive in. They materialized, moving with a silent predatory speed. They formed a perfect, semicircular cordon, blocking the exit to the parking lot, cutting off her escape. Every engine cut at once. The sudden silence was more menacing than any siren. Doors opened in unison. Men emerged, a dozen of them. They were not police officers. They were not hospital security. They wore civilian clothes, jeans, jackets, but they moved with the disciplined, coordinated efficiency of a special forces unit. They were all lean, hard, and watchful. Their eyes scanned everything, missing nothing. One of them, clearly the leader, stepped forward. He was older than the others, his hair cropped short and shot with gray. He had a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a look of permanent intensity. He walked toward the hospital entrance, his gaze sweeping over the handful of staff members who had come out to see what the commotion was about. Thorne was among them, having followed Evelyn out, 1,000 questions burning in his mind. The scarred man stopped. His eyes passed over Evelyn without a flicker of recognition. He was looking for someone else. "I'm looking for a surgeon," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. It was a voice used to being obeyed without question. "Call sign, ghost." A ripple of confusion went through the small crowd of onlookers. Thorne stared, his mind struggling to connect the dots. The name Vance had whispered. The impossible skill he had just witnessed. The arrival of these men. It couldn't be. The scarred man's eyes continued their sweep, and this time they landed on Evelyn. They lingered. He saw the blood on her t-shirt, the exhaustion in her posture, the defiance in her gray eyes. A slow, dawning realization spread across his face. "No way," he breathed. Evelyn stood her ground, her heart pounding a heavy, slow rhythm against her ribs. She was caught. The past had not just caught up with her, it had surrounded her. The man took a step closer. "Doc," he asked, his voice softer now, laced with disbelief. "Dr. Reed, is that you?" Every head swiveled from the man to Evelyn. "Dr. Reed?" Thorne felt like he'd been punched in the gut. The resume, the state college, the community hospital, it had all been a lie, a cover. Evelyn gave a slow, weary nod. There was no point in denying it any longer. The soldier broke into a wide, relieved grin. He turned to his men. "Stand down. We found her." He walked right up to her, his intense eyes searching her face. "We heard a rumor, a Jane Doe surgeon performing a field thoracotomy in a civilian ER. We had to see for ourselves. Jake Vance is alive because of you." "Again, how is he?" she asked, her voice raspy. "He's stable. They're taking him to surgery. He's going to make it." He shook his head in amazement. "They said you opened his chest with a scalpel and your bare hands." "It was necessary," she said simply. "Doc, what are you doing here, working as a nurse? We thought you were dead, or worse." "I'm retired, Master Sergeant," she said, the rank and title falling from her lips with old familiarity. "People like us don't retire, Colonel," he replied, his voice dropping respectfully. "We just find a new war." "Colonel," the word hung in the air, a bombshell that shattered the last of Thorne's denial. Nurse Richardson. The overeager, quiet woman he had belittled and mocked for 6 months. A colonel, a surgeon of such renown that an entire ranger unit had been dispatched to find her. He felt a wave of shame so profound it made him physically dizzy. He thought of every condescending remark, every dismissive gesture. He had been a pompous fool, lecturing a master on the basics of her craft. The master sergeant, whose name she now recalled was Riggs, turned to address the stunned hospital staff. "I apologize for the intrusion. My name is Master Sergeant Riggs, 75th Ranger Regiment. The man you know as Jake Vance is one of ours. He's alive tonight because of the woman standing next to me, Lieutenant Colonel Evelyn Reed, formerly of the Joint Special Operations Command, the finest trauma surgeon the United States military has ever produced." He paused, letting the words sink in. "We called her the Ghost. Because she went to places no one else would go, and she brought back men no one else could save." Riggs turned back to Evelyn. His expression grew serious. "Colonel, I'm not here just to thank you. I'm here with a request. From General Maddox himself." Evelyn's posture stiffened. "General Maddox." The head of SOC. A man she respected, but a man who was part of the system she had fled. "I'm not in the army anymore, Riggs." "This isn't an order, ma'am. It's a plea. We have a situation. A black site in Yemen. There's been an incident. Our primary medical officer was killed. We have half a dozen operators, critical condition, and the nearest surgical facility is 1,000 miles of hostile territory away. We can't move them. We need someone to go in. Someone who can operate under fire, with limited supplies. Someone who can do the impossible." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "We need the ghost." The choice was laid bare before her. Go back. Go back to the fire, the blood, the screaming. Go back to the world that had broken her, that had taken everything from her and left her with nothing but ghosts for company. Or stay here, face the consequences of her actions, a medical review board, lawsuits, maybe even prison. She looked past Riggs, at the faces of her former colleagues. She saw their shock, their awe, their confusion. She saw Thorn, his face a mask of regret and shame. This was not her world. It never had been. She was a tourist here, and her vacation was over. Her place was not in the sterile, ordered world of civilian medicine. Her place was in the chaos. In the dark places where life and death were measured in seconds. She thought of Jake Vance, his heart beating in her hand. She thought of the men in Yemen, bleeding out in the dark, waiting for a miracle. "I ran from this. I tried to become someone else." "But you can't outrun who you are. Not forever." She met Riggs's gaze, and the weariness in her own eyes was replaced by a familiar, steely resolve. "Get your pilot ready, Master Sergeant," she said, "and find me some scrubs." Thorn watched her walk past him without a backward glance. She moved with a purpose he had never seen before, a woman shedding a disguise and stepping back into her own skin. She climbed into one of the black SUVs, the door closing behind her with a solid, final thud. The convoy of trucks started their engines in unison, a low, powerful rumble that vibrated through the pavement. They pulled away as silently and efficiently as they had arrived, disappearing into the night, leaving behind a bewildered crowd and a legend reborn. The hospital corridors felt different on his walk back inside. Quieter, smaller. The world he had commanded with such absolute certainty just an hour ago now seemed trivial. A child's sandbox. He had been playing at medicine, while she had been waging a war. He found himself in the now clean Trauma 1 bay. The floor had been mopped, the bloody instruments cleared away, but the ghost of what had happened there remained. He could still see her, standing over that gurney, blood-soaked and defiant, holding a man's life in her hands. The hospital administrator, a portly man named Henderson with a perpetually worried expression, intercepted him near the nurse's station. "Marcus, what in God's name just happened?" "The police are calling, the board is calling. Who were those men? And who is this Evelyn Reed?" "Her file says she's a nurse from Ohio." Thorn looked at the administrator, and for the first time he saw him for what he was, a bureaucrat, a man of paper and policies, a man who could never comprehend the reality of what Colonel Evelyn Reed was. "Her file is a lie," Thorn said, his voice flat. "Everything we thought we knew about her was a lie." "A lie? What are you talking about?" "She performed an unauthorized, barbaric procedure. She cracked a man's chest open in the ER. The legal liability is she saved his life," Thorn cut in, his voice sharp. "She performed a procedure that I, the chief of trauma surgery, would have declared impossible." She did it with a skill I have never seen, not in 3 decades of practice. She is, without a doubt, the most gifted surgeon I have ever encountered. Henderson stared at him, dumbfounded. But she's a nurse. No, Thorne said, shaking his head slowly. She's not. We had a living legend working in our hospital for 6 months, and we were too blind and too arrogant to see it. I was too blind. The weight of his own hubris settled on him, heavy and suffocating. He had not just underestimated her. He had actively tried to diminish her. His petty ego had nearly cost a good man his life. If Vance had arrived 10 minutes later, after she had left, he would be in the morgue right now. Thorne knew it with a certainty that chilled him to the bone. His apology, when he had tried to give it in the parking lot, had been a clumsy, stammered thing. She had simply nodded, her focus already 1,000 miles away, on a new set of casualties, a new battle. His regret was irrelevant to her. It was a burden for him alone to carry. Days turned into a week. The story of the angel of the ER spread through the hospital like wildfire, mutating with each telling. She was a CIA agent, an ex-spy, a secret government weapon. The truth, as outlined by a terse, uninformative statement from the Department of Defense, was both simpler and more complex. Lieutenant Colonel Evelyn Reed was on active duty and unavailable for comment. The hospital was advised, in no uncertain terms, to drop the matter. The incident was swept under the rug. Paperwork was filed. Reports were buried. Henderson, placated by a quiet call from a 3-star general, declared the internal investigation closed. To the outside world, it was as if it had never happened. But for those who had been there, in Trauma 1, nothing would ever be the same. The resident who had fumbled the intubation now practiced with a feverish intensity. The nurses who had followed her commands moved with a new confidence. She had left a permanent mark on them all. Most of all, on Thorne. He found himself questioning everything. His techniques, his protocols, his leadership. He had been so sure of his own excellence, so wrapped up in the rigid structure of civilian medicine. He saw now that protocols were guidelines, not gospel. They were for the routine, the predictable. They were useless in the face of true chaos. Evelyn Reed operated beyond protocols. She read the chaos like a language, improvising, adapting, creating solutions out of thin air. It was a level of mastery he could only dream of achieving. 2 weeks after she had vanished into the night, a package arrived for him at the hospital. It was a simple manila envelope with no return address. Inside was a single USB drive. He took it to his office and, with a sense of trepidation, plugged it into his computer. There was only one file on it. A video. It was helmet cam footage, shaky and raw. The sound was a cacophony of gunfire and shouting. The location was a dusty, rock-strewn hellscape. Afghanistan, he saw Rangers, wounded and dying. A field hospital, or what was left of it, had been hit by a mortar. It was a scene of unimaginable carnage. And then, she appeared, a figure moving through the smoke and dust. She was younger, but it was unmistakably her. She wore full combat gear, but over it was a blood-soaked surgical gown. She moved from man to man, her hands a blur, triaging, treating, saving. She was utterly calm, her voice a steady, authoritative presence in the middle of the storm. The ghost. He watched, captivated, for nearly an hour. He saw her perform procedures with makeshift tools that would have been unthinkable in his pristine operating room. He saw her stare down death again and again and win. This was her world. This was who she was. Then, Another man appeared on the screen. An officer. He was clean, his uniform pressed, standing just outside the main chaos. He was giving her an order. Thorne could barely make out the words over the din of battle. Something about a high-value target. An order to let him die. He watched as Evelyn, as Colonel Reed, looked at the officer, then at the wounded man in question. She shook her head, a simple, defiant gesture. She turned her back on the officer and went to work on the wounded man. The officer's face, visible for only a second, was contorted with rage. Thorne recognized him from news photos. Colonel Sterling. A rising star in the command structure, a man known for his ruthlessness. The footage cut out. Thorne sat back in his chair, his heart pounding. He finally understood. She hadn't just retired, she had been forced out. Betrayed, she had disobeyed an unlawful order, chosen her oath as a doctor over her duty as a soldier, and they had tried to bury her for it. Her quiet life as Nurse Richardson wasn't an escape. It was a prison, a form of exile. He deleted the file and wiped the drive, as he was sure he was meant to. The message was clear. This was the reason she was hiding. And now, she wasn't hiding anymore. A month later, another surprise. General Maddox himself requested a meeting. Not in Washington, but here, at the hospital. Thorne met him in the hospital's boardroom. Maddox was a tall, imposing man who carried the weight of his command with an easy grace. He came straight to the point. "Dr. Thorne, I'm here to talk about Colonel Reed. She's all right?" Thorne asked, the question coming out before he could stop it. A faint smile touched the general's lips. She's effective. The mission in Yemen was a success. She saved all 6 operators, pulled off 3 different emergency procedures that are, and I quote the after-action report, medically unprecedented. "I'm not surprised," Thorne said quietly. "No, I suppose you aren't," Maddox said. "Which is why I'm here. Colonel Reed has reconsidered her retirement. On her own terms. She has identified a gap in our military medical capabilities. A big one. Our surgeons are the best in the world, but they are trained for the clean, controlled environment of a field hospital. They are not trained for the ditch, for the back of a truck, for the kind of front line under fire trauma surgery that she specializes in." He leaned forward, his eyes locking with Thorne's. "She has proposed the creation of a new unit, a small, elite team of surgeons and medics who can be deployed into the most hostile environments imaginable. A surgical combat application group. A scalpel, not a sledgehammer. They won't be soldiers who happen to be doctors, they will be warriors who happen to be surgeons." "And what does this have to do with me?" Thorne asked. "She needs a base of operations, a civilian hospital here in the States where she can train her people. A place where they can hone their skills on civilian trauma before deploying. A place that understands the unique bridge between conventional and combat medicine. She believes this hospital and its chief of trauma could be that place." Thorne was stunned into silence. "A partnership. With her. With the ghost. She recommended you," Maddox continued. "She said you were arrogant, by the book, and a pain in the ass. But she also said that you were willing to see when you were wrong. That you could learn. In her world, that's a rarer quality than surgical skill." It was the most backhanded compliment Thorne had ever received. And the most meaningful. He thought of his career, the accolades, the publications, the comfortable prestige. It all seemed like dust now. Meaningless, here was a chance to be part of something real. something that mattered, a chance to learn from the best, and in doing so, to atone for his own ignorance. "Yes," Thorne said, the single word filled with a conviction he hadn't felt in years. "The answer is yes. Whatever she needs." The general smiled. "I thought you might say that." 6 months later, the west wing of the hospital was transformed. It was now the Center for Advanced Combat Trauma and Surgical Readiness, a joint venture between the hospital and the Department of Defense. It was a state-of-the-art facility, complete with simulation labs that could replicate the sights, sounds, and stresses of a combat zone, and at its head was Colonel Evelyn Reed. She was no longer hiding. She wore her uniform with an easy authority, the silver eagle on her collar gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She moved with the same quiet confidence, but the weariness in her eyes was gone, replaced by a fierce, burning purpose. Thorne was her civilian counterpart, the co-director of the program. He had become her student, her ally, and, to his own surprise, her friend. He learned more from her in those 6 months than he had in the previous 10 years of his career. She taught him how to think outside the box, how to see the patient beyond the protocol. In return, he taught her how to navigate the bureaucracy of civilian medicine, how to translate her battlefield innovations into practices that could save lives right here at home. One afternoon, he found her in the main simulation lab. She was standing before a new class of trainees, cocky, talented young surgeons handpicked from every branch of the military. They had the same arrogant swagger he once had. They thought they were the best. They had no idea what they were about to learn. The simulation began. The lights flickered and died, replaced by the strobing chaos of a battlefield. The sound of explosions and machine gun fire filled the room. A high-fidelity mannequin on the operating table began to bleed profusely from multiple traumatic injuries. The young surgeon in charge froze, his eyes wide with panic. The carefully constructed world of his training had just evaporated. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise. "Forget the textbook," she said, her voice calm and clear. "The textbook is written for a world that doesn't exist anymore. Out here, there is only the patient, the clock in your hands. The rules are simple. You stop the bleeding. You start the breathing. And you get them home. Now, let's get to work." She picked up a scalpel, and in the controlled chaos of the simulation, under the watchful eyes of a new generation of healers, the ghost began her hunt. Thorne watched from the observation deck, a sense of profound awe washing over him. She was not just teaching surgery, she was forging weapons. Not weapons of war, but of life. And in finding her own purpose, she had given him one, too. The quiet nurse was gone. In her place stood a leader, a mentor, a legend, and he was privileged to stand in her shadow.